And we're live.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And now we'll have the session Cavell and the Achievement of Selfhood by Professor Richard Eldridge. He's a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He is the author, most recently, of Werner Herzog, filmmaker and philosopher, and Images of History, Kant, Benjamin, Freedom and the Human Subject. He is the general editor of Oxford Studies in Philosophy and Literature, the editor of Stanley Cavell, and the co-editor with Bernard Wright of Stanley Cavell and Literary Studies. His respondent will be Eric. Eric has been a visiting Dr. Fellow at the University of Chicago Center for German Philosophy and the Freie University of Berlin. He is currently a lecturer and visiting scholar in the Vanderbilt University Philosophy Department, as well as Social Justice Fellow at the Rafa Institute in Nashville. Questions can be made in the chat. Guys, it's on you.
Good, thank you. Two short preliminary remarks. The first is that, as some of you may know, Cavell has been the single most important figure or influence on my own career, going back to the fact that I based my application essay, my personal statement of my interest for graduate school, largely on the essay Aesthetic Problems of Modern Philosophy. I read Cavell as an undergraduate, first with Stanley Bates and then with Tim Gould. And then my primary teacher in graduate school was Ted Cohen, all students of Cavell's. Cavell, in effect, showed me the way in which I could do philosophy. And then second, I wanted to thank Ioannidis for organizing this conference. It's wonderful to see Cavell's work being taken up all over the world and after his death. This is just extraordinarily encouraging, and I value the opportunity I've had to get to know some of you and to interact with you. So thank you, Ioannidis. Here's the paper then, Cavell and the Achievement of Selfhood. Here is a passage from the discussion of rhythm in music in Hegel's Aesthetics. There it is on your screen. That will, I suggest, help us to make sense of some important ideas in Cavell about the achievement of selfhood. This runs some risk, I'm well aware, of explicating the obscure, Cavell, by reference to the unintelligible, Hegel. But let's see. So here's the passage. I'll read through it. The I is not indeterminate persistence and uninterrupted duration, but rather only becomes a self. That's the idea I'm going to focus on, the becoming of a self, as collection and return into itself. The German is als Sammlung und Rückkehr in sich. There's a long footnote here comparing this to a passage on memory and selfhood in Augustine's Confessions. I won't read that, but that's a connection worth following. So the I is not indeterminate persistence and uninterrupted duration, but rather only becomes a self as collection and return into itself. It transforms this sublation of itself, through which it becomes an object to itself, into being for itself, and is now, through this relation to itself, for the first time, self-feeling and self-consciousness, and so forth. This collection essentially involves an interruption of merely undetermined change, which is what we had had before us, in that the arising and passing away, the disappearance and renewal of points of time was, prior to this collection, nothing but a merely formal passing over from each now to another similar one, and thus nothing but an uninterrupted further movement. In contrast with this empty moving forward of events in time, the self is that which exists with itself, and its collection into itself interrupts the indeterminate succession of points of time, makes cuts in their abstract continuity, and frees the I, which remembers itself in these now discrete moments of its experience and retrieves itself in them from mere self-externalization and change. Well, not the most transparent passage in the world, but here's my gloss on it. Here, neither the I nor the self is a fixed, given, persistent thing, if it is even correct to think of it as a thing at all. Rather, there is a living, embodied human being who first develops an I, or sense of self, as locus of agency through collecting its sensations, that is, holding them together as cessations that pertain to a this in the world. We might think here of an infant developing not yet conceptually articulated proprioceptive awareness of the position of its hand and its own effects as agent on the hand's motion and on the accompanying sensations. In a second step, this initial sublation of itself, through which it has become initially but inarticulately aware of itself as a thing in interaction with things in the world, is then extended by memory and the focusing of attention on the object interacted with as distinct from other objects. The object, a hand, a rattle, a plush toy, is held in mind as a recognizable thing under a proto-concept, so that the infant becomes a conscious classifier or proto-claim maker, a being for itself who takes itself to be interacting with recognizable things. All this counts as the interruption through the emergence of an embodied subject who thinks and does things of what would otherwise be a mere succession of law-governed events in nature. Instead of indeterminate succession of mere events, there is now a subject attending to objects recognitively and holding them before itself. Through this interruption or cut in experience, the thus emergent subject is, as Hegel puts it, freed from mere self-externalization and change. Interestingly, the reason that this passage occurs in Hegel's discussion of rhythm in music is that the experience of rhythm can feed what the cognitive archaeologist Lambros Malafordus, echoing Antonio Damasio, calls a complex associative enchainment between the internal and external elements of remembering. The experience of rhythm helps our sensations, sense of agency, and registerings of objects as objects to sync up, thus bringing the world into view for an emergent subject. That the I or the subject emerges, or that selfhood is achieved in having a sense of agency in exercise and a somewhat stabilized point of view on things, is, of course, also and even more familiar to us from Freud. Freud adds, or makes explicit, the further thought that this emergence and achievement are never complete, as the ego remains caught between troubling libidinal fantasies and superego commands that are internalizations of the authority of others. Given further the variety of others with whom we must engage and who frequently have conflicting habits of judgment and expectations for us, how to exercise agency and stabilize selfhood satisfactorily remains a fraught issue for us. The continuing conflicting pressures on the subject in development are the stuffs of dreams, parapraxes, jokes, and neuroses. Hegel similarly notes the standing possibility, what he describes as a rupture between my psychical and my waking being. The psychical being is primary process sensual. My waking being is my ego-oriented being. A rupture between my psychical and my waking being, between my spontaneous natural feeling and my mediated intellectual consciousness. A rupture which, since everyone embraces these two sides in himself, is of course a possibility in even the healthiest individual, but does not actually exist in everyone. Cavell's own experience of Freud is as formative for him as the experience of any other writer, save perhaps Wittgenstein. And the encounter with Wittgenstein was already prepared and shaped by his prior encounter with Freud. During his brief time at Juilliard in 1947-48, Cavell reports that he found his ambition to compose music replaced, as it were, by reading Freud 10 to 12 hours a day, successively contracting the symptoms of hysteria and of obsession depicted in the introductory lectures. In addition, Cavell himself twice entered psychoanalytic treatment, once in the late 1950s under the pressure of a foundering first marriage and as he was having difficulty completing his doctoral dissertation, once again in the late 1970s, as he was encountering the demands of fatherhood for a second time at a late age, and having trouble transforming the dissertation material into what would become the claim of reason. Two thoughts that derive from his encounters with Freud are especially important for Cavell. Now I need to figure out how to get the next slide. There it got, that does it.
Yeah, it worked.
First, thinking about a succession of minor childhood accidents, Cavell finds himself, he reports, here's the quotation, responding to a recurrent surmise of mine that whatever happens, whatever is eventful enough for speech, is from the beginning accidental, as if a human life is inherently interrupted, things chronically occurring at unripe times, in the wrong tempo, comically or poignantly. This is not incompatible with Freud's view that there are no accidents. What this now means to me, there are no accidents, plus there are always interruptions in the accidental, is that we chronically interrupt ourselves, say we fail to give the right quality or quantity or time to our thoughts or deeds. I think of that idea as the perception that we're haunting the world, rather than living effectively in it. What this passage says is that in our efforts at achieving stable, fluent subjecthood, at achieving in Hegelian terms freedom or being with oneself in another, bei sich selbst in einem anderen, we are always in circumstances we can't control, find ourselves getting in the way of ourselves, persisting in awkwardness and anxiety, and failing to achieve full at-homeness in what we do, as new things always happen. Second, out of this experience of immigrancy in the exercise of conceptually structured agency, there then arises a sense of a need for liberation that Cavell also finds articulated in Freud. The sufferer, Cavell remarks, here's the next passage, has to be, as Freud characteristically puts the matter, awakened from feeling himself a prisoner of his circumstances. This sense of imprisonment, of the need for liberation, is critical both for Wittgensteinian philosophizing and for Emersonian perfectionist aspiration. I have sometimes called it the crisis from which the wish for philosophy and for a morally comprehensible life begins. In this remarkable passage, Freud is invoked in order to characterize the motivation of the writerly, self-interrogative styles of doing philosophy, those of Wittgenstein and Emerson, that have been most immediately influential for Cavell's own philosophical writing, and in furthering his sense of the contours of a genuinely available liberation from chaotic succession and into greater practical self-comprehension. Beyond scattered remarks about Freud, Cavell's own most extended and powerful pieces of writing on the development of the emergent subject away from anxiety and toward fluency, as an unending task, are The Argument of the Ordinary in Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome, and the excursus on Wittgenstein's vision of language in The Claim of Reason. In the later 1990 text, that is The Argument of the Ordinary, Cavell characterizes the portrait of the human self in philosophical investigations as one that, like Plato's and Freud's visions, presents a self that incorporates selves, thus alluding to the introjection of authoritative others into the formation of the superego that is essential to the emergence of selfhood. Kripke's error in reading Wittgenstein, as Cavell sees it, is that he evades Wittgenstein's preoccupation with philosophy's desire to underestimate or evade the ordinary. Kripke, that is, fails to recognize anxieties about selfhood in development in relations with others that themselves drive the human subject, as Wittgenstein depicts it in the first voice of the investigations, one of his contending voices and one of ours, ever anew to seek a ground of perfect authority in conceptual performance, and thus to overcome the very possibility of shame. In this way, by seeking this perfect authority within, we live our skepticism as a disappointment with the ordinary's inability to provide that perfect authority, as concept applications and resultant roots of practice and interest remain always in part divided and contested, and in a resultant turn toward fantasized perfect authority in an unmediated encounter with something within. The problem that leads to skepticism is not a self-standing intellectual problem, but rather the very need to ask the question, do I know anything with absolute, unimpugnable certainty? A need that is always already motivated by the standing immigrancy of the human subject. The excursus on Wittgenstein's vision on language is oriented around the fundamental thought that, quote, learning is not as academic a matter as academics are apt to suppose. We might think here of Socrates in the Symposium, who notes that one does not acquire wisdom in practice in the way that water always flows from a full cup into an empty one when we connect them with a piece of yarn. It's not just smooth information transfer. In particular, learning a language is neither a matter only of information intake and processing, nor a matter of being told what a name means or learning new words. Instead, it involves coming to recognize and take an interest in some things in which others also take an interest, and manifesting that interest in a bodily behavioral repertoire that involves emotion, stance, gaze, and awareness of others as well as simply pronouncing some object A to be F. How much of all this is learned when is never fully settled, even if broad competence in a normal domain can be determined, insofar as what other different subjects become interested in and how they may display that interest is itself never fully settled. The learning is, as Cavell puts it, never over, and we keep finding new potencies in words and new ways in which objects are disclosed. Projections of words onto things are both stable enough to admit of being shared enough and tolerant of new usages. As Wittgenstein says at Investigation 68, the use of a word is not everywhere bounded by rules. It is always possible to find oneself with another in certain straits of circumstance where it is unclear whether going on together is possible. Driven by existential anxiety about the authoritativeness of his claim-making as a subject, the skeptic removes himself from the communicative testing of mutual intelligibility, hoping instead to find absolute assurance within. But nothing is more human than the wish to deny one's humanity, or to assert it at the expense of others, Cavell writes, precisely by withdrawing from engagement with them. The fact that, for Cavell, it is within the communicative testing of mutual intelligibility, and only within that testing, within the argument of the ordinary, that selfhood as at least partial at-homeness in conceptual and practical agency can be achieved, explains Cavell's sense that in philosophy, as he writes, there are certain arguments that must not be won. To absent oneself from communicative interaction in a putative reversion to absolute conceptual authority is to abandon all possibilities of reassurance and recognition in communicative practice, even if nothing is more human than to do this. As early as Aesthetic Problems of Modern Philosophy, Cavell urged that introducing supposedly authoritative formulae in the form of necessarily true statements of necessary and sufficient conditions is often, even typically, a way of stunting one's own responsiveness, both to difficult phenomena that require patient, ambivalent attention, and to others who might respond differently, and in doing so help one to notice things one might oneself have missed. In contrast with strict definition mongering, the definitional claims of philosophy ought rather to be modeled on the procedures of the ordinary language philosopher, who issues claims about what we say, not in order to foreclose conversation, but instead to test the possibility and shape of shared response. Philosophy's first virtue, as it matters most to me, as Cavell puts it in Cities of Words, is responsiveness, not doctrinal knowledge. We live and achieve selfhood to the extent that we can, as assurance in exercises of conceptual and practical agency, always already within a largely shared but never fully fixed and bounded field of concepts and possibilities of interest, always already within a partially open form of life, with possibilities of expressive vertical development. Within this field and form of life, as Cavell writes, the human necessity of the quest for home and the human fact of immigrancy are together seen as aspects of the human as such. We are now, I think, in a position to make fuller sense of a crucial early passage on the achievement of selfhood from the world viewed. This is the passage I've been aiming at all along here. At some point, the unhinging of our consciousness from the world interposed our subjectivity between us and our presentness to the world. Then our subjectivity became what is present to us. Individuality became isolation. Apart from the wish for selfhood, hence the always simultaneous granting of otherness as well, I do not understand the value of art. Apart from this wish and its achievement, art is exhibition. I have some memory of how stunned I was by reading this passage at roughly the age of 20 in an undergraduate class in my junior year. Initially, this passage bears some comparison with Pierre Hadot's work on ancient philosophy as a set of spiritual exercises or practices for the cultivation of the self within the various ancient schools, rather than a body of systematic theory, a topic that, or comparison that Raphael Aziz mentioned. And as I said, I owe my knowledge of Hadot to Raphael. Like Cavell, Hadot holds that, especially in its origins, the philosophical act is not situated merely on the cognitive level, that's citing Hadot, but is rather initiated by an unhappy disquiet before conversion. Philosophy begins in disappointment for Cavell. Similarly, for Cavell, the thinkers and artists, he writes, whose work he is most concerned to take up in Cities of Words, each develop and enact what he calls a perspective of judgment upon the world as it is, measured against the world as it may be, that tends to express disappointment with the world as it is, as the scene of human activities and prospects, and perhaps to lodge the demand or desire for reform or transfiguration of the world. According to Hadot, this displacement of spiritual exercises by theoria occurred first during the late medieval period, with the systematization of theology as a master body of knowledge within the university. And it was then sealed in the early modern period in the work of Descartes. Cavell similarly notes, just a page earlier than the key passage about the achievement of selfhood that I cited from the World Viewed, that there has been what he calls a human wish intensifying since the Reformation to escape subjectivity and metaphysical isolation, a wish for the power to reach this world, having for so long tried, at last hopelessly, to manifest fidelity to another. The allusion here, I think, in the World Viewed is presumably to the kingdom of God, or church triumphant, as the object to which we once sought to be faithful. We've lost our grip on spiritual exercises for doing this in practice, Cavell suggests. But where, according to Hadot, this displacement of philosophia or spiritual exercises by theoria, this displacement might and should be reversed taking up some elements of Epicurean and Stoic practice, as perhaps Nietzsche also urged. That's what Hadot holds. Matters are less clear with Cavell. The wish for selfhood, for heightened assurance in exercises of conceptual and practical agency, has intensified since the Reformation rather than being displaced. It is, if anything, more sharply present, intensified, albeit in an ineffective way, in Cartesian and post-Cartesian skepticism and realism, two sides of the same coin for Cavell, two responses to the same initiating unhinging of subjectivity from the world. It's even more present there, this wish, than in earlier practices of philosophy. And unlike Hadot, there is for Cavell no obvious way out of the bearing of the wish for selfhood unsatisfied, at least in some measure. Nor was there any time in a recognizably human form of life in which that wish was not somehow borne by some as freighted with existential anxiety. Achilles and Oedipus, for example, were trying to figure out who they could most coherently, intelligibly, and recognizably be in practice. We live among and with others who are different from us in various dimensions of interest and activity, where these differences are sharp enough to block standing general assurance and to leave its achievement always in question. But while there is no obvious place to go, either to satisfy fully or to be free of the wish for selfhood, there are also possibilities of address to that wish that are manifest in the work of major artists and those among the philosophers who rank with them. Such figures, from Plato to Wittgenstein, from Shakespeare to Ibsen, from Thoreau to Emerson, from Frank Capra to Leo McCarey, sometimes find themselves in their work achieving a kind of fullness of attention to life and its difficult phenomena, to which audiences of considerable circumference can and have resonated, where the object of resonance is less a formulable solution to the problem of the achievement of selfhood than a dramatized itinerary of either approach to selfhood or evasion of it. I think this accounts for the appeal of Cavell as a writer, that he gives us a dramatized itinerary of his approaches to selfhood and sometimes evasions of it, rather than a solution to the problem of achieving selfhood. Toward the end of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel wrote, "For it is in the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Human nature only really exists in an achieved community of minds." Taken as a biological claim, human nature only exists in an achieved community of minds, this remark is outrageously false. The existence of human nature biologically requires nothing more than a living being with 46 chromosomes. But this obvious falsity is here a mark of the metaphorical. The next sentence in Hegel reads, "The anti-human, the merely animal, consists in staying within the sphere of feeling and being able to communicate only at that level." This makes it clear that Hegel's thought must be, first, that we fail to exist as distinctly human subjects, insofar as we fail to achieve and maintain selfhood through exercises of conceptual and practical agency that win assurance and recognition in communicative interaction. And second, that we can do better. That is, the thought is, if we don't do this, we haunt the world. That it remains our task to do this ever anew and ever incompletely. The fate of reason, or of our being self-conscious, reflective beings, is a thought that has nowhere been kept more alive and movingly pertinent to us than in the work of Stanley Cavell. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Richard. Well, Eric, please go ahead.
Richard, thank you so much. I'm in the wonderful and somewhat humbling position of having now heard this paper and also read it a couple of times, to have gotten slightly, just taken more of an interest, and there's so many things that we could talk about. But as you know, I just have these three questions to start off the discussion. I also just wanted to, say how much I have already learned from your work on Cavell and how grateful I am just to be here having this discussion. So my first question is there a particular reason that the paper does not bring in the concept of moral or Emersonian perfectionism? On the one hand, the absence is perplexing because the notion of selfhood that emerges in this paper, as I understand it, the self not as a static object, nor perhaps as an object or thing at all, as you say right at the start, but as something more like the recurring task or activity of re-inhabiting our life world with concepts, implying also, I think, pivotally, that loss or dispossession of that life world is a regular human occurrence. This notion of selfhood receives its most direct treatment while Cavell is unpacking the concept of moral perfectionism. So some of the passages on the self that are a kind of basis for the paper are from Conditions, Handsome and Unhandsome, and Cities of Words, two texts which, as you know, present themselves as doing their work primarily under the heading of moral or Emersonian perfectionism. So the absence of the concept was curious to me. But I just, in thinking about it more, perhaps the notion of moral perfectionism, as we're sort of thinking about how to write and talk about Cavell the best way, perhaps it does bring in too many other issues. I do think Cavell puts several quite different things under the heading of moral perfectionism, including a contribution to ethics, some notion or account of selfhood, as this paper starts to unveil, a practice of re-inhabiting finite conditions after temptations of skepticism or transcendence, an activity of excavating and confronting social conditions of self-formation that resonate with trends in critical social theory now, the basis of a film genre and pursuits, and so much more, such that it is sometimes hard to differentiate Cavell's concept of moral perfectionism from sort of the rest of his work. So I would be curious to know if this sometimes confusing multivalence, or perhaps more generously, development in Cavell's account of moral perfectionism is why Professor Eldridge decided not to employ this concept in his paper. So the first question just has to do with, how does this account here have to do or interact with Cavell's notion of moral or Emersonian perfectionism? Second and related question, the paper emphasizes, rightly to my mind, something like the normality, that's probably not the right word, but the regularity, let's say, of interruptions, challenges, what Cavell sometimes called crises, in the achievement of selfhood, as well as the place in Cavell's philosophy for patience with recovering from these crises. All of this is by within the concept of selfhood, as Cavell puts it more or less in conditions, to have a self is to repeatedly lose it in some sense before refinding our footing. And this is my question, but if this is right, then why call the idea of the paper and the title of the paper the achievement of selfhood? In several places, the paper stresses that there is no final achievement, the regularity of being lost and so forth. And so by the very logic of the paper, achievement would be re-achievement maybe, or renewal, something of that sort. And a bit more tentatively, but to stress something of what I was trying to do yesterday with the mixed blessing of finitude, I'm curious if you agree that we might just as well emphasize the negative side of the concept of self in Cavell's work, namely something like the repeated anxiety. Surely Cavell invites us to rethink what counts as achieving our selfhood, such that it would involve or even necessitate such anxieties and losses. The word achievement and achievement of selfhood seem to me to evoke the very finality of selfhood that is, under critique in the paper. So as if these two big questions were not big enough, there is a third and perhaps broader one. And this really one is just a question. the role of music, or perhaps more specifically rhythm, in the repeated anxieties and achievements of selfhood on Cavell's account. The paper opens with a passage that occurs in Hegel's discussion of rhythm, which I had never read before, and I was extremely grateful to encounter that. And then there's this extremely intriguing, suggestion or gloss on that passage on page 3, quote, "The experience of rhythm helps our sensations, sense of agency, and registerings of objects as objects to sync up, thus bringing the world into view for an emergent subject," end quote. So is the idea here that rhythm helps us to go on from one next state of self to the next? Would this further suggest that we go on from crises according to a rhythm? And if so, assuming that this rhythm is not external to the activity of achieving selfhood, but internal to it, what is it in that process of, say, metamorphosis or reachievement of selfhood that provides such a rhythm? And I found myself wondering whether this could be related to exemplification and the necessity of something like role models on Cavell's account. In other words, just to put my question maybe succinctly, does the exemplary other in the reachievement of selfhood provide the rhythm for my change? I think here of the idea, which I heard from Esther Perel, the psychoanalyst, that couples have a rhythm, and perhaps friends have rhythms as well. Anyway, if these questions aren't the right ones, or that are taking this not in the direction that you want to go, I would still greatly enjoy any thoughts on the place or places of music in Cavell's idea of selfhood. Because as this paper, stresses, music was just so important to both the practice and the study of it. So thank you for a wonderful paper and a chance to comment.
Thank you. These are terrific questions, so I feel very well understood to begin with. That's always reassuring when one presents a paper. I can give fairly compact answers, I think, to all three of them, especially to the first one. So is there a particular reason that the paper does not bring in the concept of moral or Emersonian perfection? The simple answer is no, there's no reason other than it didn't occur to me, and it might well have. It's certainly pertinent. There was a light allusion in the paper to the thought that selfhood has a vertical biological dimension, and to the idea that we must achieve our humanity. This, I think, is already moving in the direction of Emersonian perfectionism. I would find myself, I think, I've never resonated to Emerson quite as much as Cavell has, to be honest. I find the Emersonian sentence too arch very often. Though I can see what Cavell is getting at in Emerson. The Thoreau book is perhaps more explicit and closer to the things I'm doing when he distinguishes in the Thoreau book between the watchman self and the workman self, and trying to get these two sides, the one that betakes itself to something, the figure of commitment, the workman self, and the watchman self, the reflective monitoring self, to sync up, as it were, to approve each other's doings. So there's a American philosophy reference that I think is very close to what I was talking about. But the simple answer is it just didn't occur to me in writing the paper. The second question, why the word achievement? Well, that comes primarily, I can give several answers to that. The simplest answer is it was the passage from the worldview on the achievement of selfhood that got me started, and that it is the value or office of art to figure in the achievement of selfhood. I wanted to emphasize that selfhood is a role or status concept, not a given, something one arrives at, achieves, or entered into. Also, I did want to record the thought that that status or role can be sometimes, with luck, reasonably well entered into or fulfilled. I am thinking here of the happy couples in pursuits of happiness, who seem to me, in their relations to each other, fully realized, alert and attentive figures. I do think it's possible, though, to read Cavell's use of the word achievement here as more like the gerundive achieving. It is a process. I did not at all mean to suggest that it was final or complete. And that brings me to the third most interesting question, the role of music. This I will think about for a while. There certainly are, as I've emphasized, repeated anxieties in the ongoing life of forming and expressing selfhood. I've been thinking about, for some time, music as providing a model for how we cope with these anxieties. I actually have a long paper on Hegel's philosophy of music in which I develop this idea. And the thought is that we get a kind of satisfaction in what I call, following Hegel, cadencing, right? As though conflicting material is introduced, at least in classical sonata form, broken down, mixed up, until there is a way of arriving at a coinciding thematic, harmonic, and melodic resolution that counts as satisfying, even though it isn't, as it were, stated in words as having any definite doctrinal content. I'm quite interested in that. I'm working on a paper at the moment on aesthetic authority in lyric poetry, in which part of the paper is on the role of rhythm in lyric poetry and how a poem achieves its end without proving anything, at least not proving anything in the way that's modeled on deductive or inductive logic. I'm interested in the paper here in what I call a dramatized itinerary of approaches to selfhood and how those dramatized itineraries can achieve, right, what I'm now calling cadencing, or sometimes it's called dramatic closure rather than doctrinal closure. I'm thinking here of Barbara Herrnstein's very nice book on poetic closure. That happens finally in finding or hitting a rhythm, and in a way, finding or hitting a rhythm with another person also seems to me exactly right. This is, I think, what's going on in the ability of the couples to keep up with one another conversationally in pursuits of happiness. Poor Bruce in His Girl Friday just can't keep up, right? Cary Grant and Barbara Stanwyck can keep up with each other, or Rosalind Russell in His Girl Friday can keep up with each other. Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable can do that, especially in the play acting for the detectives improvisation scene in It Happened One Night. Yeah, finding that kind of rhythm with another person is really important. And I need to think about how to put all of these thoughts together: rhythm, cadencing, dramatic closure, aesthetic authority. This is the main topic I actually think about right now, and think about how to achieve this in my own writing as a way of doing philosophy. That's a topic that's always on my mind. So it was very smart of you to see that. That's it. That's what I've got.
Should so just really quickly, maybe to continue the discussion around the third point, this notion of a dramatic itinerary of achieving the selfhood. So just tell me if this is right. We should be understanding something about the form or the style of Cavell's philosophy as involving a rhythm, and as that rhythm as being required for the kind of performativity of or I don't know if that's the right word, but the way in which he models the achievement of selfhood, that requires a rhythm.
Yes, I think that's right. I think we are drawn into identification with the staging of his subjectivity in the text very often. Yeah.
And this is something I have thought about quite a bit, and this I think is important to Emersonian perfectionism, because he also wants, as he says, I think in the interview, someone's talking about Emerson, and he says something like, "But don't you find that Emerson leaves you to yourself?" So there's something about the rhythm or that dramatic itinerary that continually also, I think, resists identification. There needs to be something like enough identification to spark your own dramatic, dramatized itinerary. I love that phrase. But there also has to be some kind of separation.
I think the best way to think about that topic, a thought I owe to one of my earliest undergraduate teachers on Cavell, Tim Gould, in his wonderful essay on Wordsworth and Kant on genius, is to think about Kant's conception of genius as nach Machung, following after the exemplary figure, not imitating or aping it. So what one identifies with is, in some sense, the process of the development and expression of power in the precursor. But one's own materials and circumstances are different. And after all, if one did exactly the same thing, that would not be an expression of an exercise of powers of original meaning making in life or in art. It would be mere copying. So that, I think, is part of the logic of the development of fuller, more enhanced or powerful and expressive subjectivity in general. Do I want to say any more about that? It's part of the thought that what we need to do is understand how we ourselves can do that. Oh, yes, the other thought was this puts us in the region of Michael Fried on how the techniques for producing absorption and defeating theatricality have themselves to be modified in light of the achievement of the precursor. You can't simply paint exactly the same way your precursor painted. Likewise in music. Beethoven and Mozart are massively influenced and inspired by Haydn and Bach before Haydn, but they want to write in a way that echoes and mirrors the achievement of original power and order that appeared in Bach or Haydn, not just to do Bach or Haydn over again. So yeah, I think this is part of the life of subjectivity as such.
And maybe we should open it up because probably tired of my comments, but another related notion is what I think at least some anthropologists or social anthropologists, describe as the role of mimesis in just human development, and the way young children they require in order to grow. Just
absolutely correct, right? Aristotle in Poetics says there are two reasons why human beings delight in imitation. The first is it's natural to them. They like recognizing things. And then he says, and it is through mimesis that they take their first steps in learning. Right? You can only begin to get control of your body, of your judgments, of your life in general through imitation. That seems to me to be thoroughly right. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you both. That was a fascinating conversation. I may have some follow-ups, but I would like to open to everybody. If someone else wants to ask a question, just let me know. But perhaps some quick follow-ups.
Can you turn everyone on, Ioannidis, so we can see people?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
I hope everybody's okay with it. If you're not, let me know. I was very curious to hear you about achievement because, after Eric's question, because I remember having a similar kind of difficulty when I wrote not about the achievement of the self, but the achievement of meaning. And I remember because when I tried to express how can we achieve meaning in our given some things that you yourself say in your paper, the way Cavell conceives the task of achieving meaning as opposed to the way Kripke conceives it. Kripke seems to depict the way the teacher teaches the pupil how to add. Sorry about that. It's hard for me to say that word. As he has to do whatever I do, otherwise he's wrong, and I'm right. I have the authority about this. And Cavell says, well, in Wittgenstein there is a kind of hesitation. The teacher says, well, this is what I do, but it as if presenting my limitation. There is so meaning for me when I was trying to express that kind of challenge. I said something about meaning being a continual task, something that we are always. I also say something about the ordinary being a moving target. It's always something that we are trying to achieve, but so achievement is always momentary. It's always, risky. I can always discover that I was wrong or something like that. And I think the same applies to the achievement of the self, given this Emersonian view of I'm always, whenever I achieve selfhood, it's momentary, and I will, if I keep advancing in the direction of that unattained but attainable self, I'm always in that kind of development. But can't I say that I achieve for a while, for a little bit, or I can discover I was wrong? But achievement in the real world is always this kind of achievement. It's never final or something like that. So perhaps it's in part just because I'm not a native speaker. I'm not sure if we can use the word achievement in those connections, but that's kind of the way I thought about meaning, and perhaps it connects with this discussion.
No, I think that's all correct. I mean, I do think, as I suggested, achievement can bear a kind of gerundive sense, and it is the word Cavell uses in The World Viewed, about momentary, never assured, certainly. I guess one can hope that the moment can last, it could be a pretty long moment. There are such things, I hope, as happy marriages, at least. Though even that, I wouldn't want to say that they require work, but they require continuing willingness for repetition, as Cavell puts it, continual investing of energy in some sense. So that seems to me right. About crypti, I think, Arata may want to say something about this. He alluded to this yesterday. What you get in crypti, I think, is a combination of threat and acquiescence to the way things are done. The teacher is not the exemplar or precursor. It's as though crypti got stuck in Hegelian terms at the stage of the master-slave struggle, as opposed to people independently having a share in how we are to go on. So no, I think crypti, it's not an attractive view philosophically that all there is conditioning or threat and acquiescence to what is to be said when. That's a rather distressing view. And with Cavell, I think it's not the right way to read Wittgenstein either. I don't see Wittgenstein as urging, that amounts to a kind of behaviorist reading of Wittgenstein ultimately, which I think is not right.
I was going to say for a Cavellian, that's not an attractive view, but I participated in many conferences about Wittgenstein, and I discussed with many people who, just find that an attractive view of Wittgenstein.
I know, I have too, and I think there's an explanation for that, and the explanation is philosophy's, Raphael was talking about this, overwhelming commitment to theoria and the scientific report as the model of what we're trying to achieve, as though there's a repression or denial of the very things, disappointment with life, a sense of incompleteness and existential anxiety that really get philosophy started. A repression of all that's endemic to academic philosophy, and I would even say to a fair stretch of continental as well as analytic philosophy. It's not only analytic.
Oh, great. I might have some other questions later, but let's open for Arata said he has a question, so perhaps we can start with Arata.
So thank you, Richard. That was really wonderful. So Rich and I many wonderful sort of apt and insightful formulations. So I'm still taking it in. I guess first, before going to ask my question, I just about Kripke. I mean, it seems like Kripke and so many others are sort of are thinking of meaning in what Cavell would call it like a moralistic sense, that it's it's, I mean, and so they miss the the essential role that, like, what he calls exemplarity plays, in teaching, and in not just in teaching children, but in communicating, and so the possibility, of disagreement, is viewed as a skeptical threat, as something that has to somehow be overcome, whereas it seems for Cavell to be actually a condition of meaning. So anyway, I mean, I think I'm probably just rehearsing things here that people are already aware of. But so I guess this is actually a question, you, Richard, about the sense of the never completed character of the self, that it's always, so to speak, well, I'm not sure exactly how to put it. I was going to say in process or something like that, but that seems to be potentially misleading. I mean, one thing, as you know, one thing that the Cavell sort of rejects is what you might call like a teleological conception of self-formation, where that's understood as where incompleteness would be understood as stages in a progression toward some sort of ideal. So here you might think of Kant's conception of virtue as this kind of endless progress toward perfection, which is never attainable. Seems like Cavell sort of rejects that sort of model of conceiving of the self as incomplete. But then his other, so then I guess this is just a question about how should we conceive of the task and of selfhood and the measuring of oneself in relation to this task, given that and if this is right, that it's not to be understood, as it were, sort of teleologically as steps toward something, but rather as and here he uses some different images. I think it's and that the idea of transformation comes into play here, and the idea of nextness, where you're just it's almost anyway, I don't know, I don't really know how to
I think I have
so if you could just say something about how the character of completeness and incompleteness should be understood in relation to the task of achieving selfhood.
Well, first, Cavell is not completely or consistently. We're getting an echo. Am I coming to it? Yeah, good. I think Cavell is not completely or absolutely anti-teleological. I'll say more about the way in which he is in a moment. I think, in fact, he has a pretty Hegelian sense of the teleology of selfhood. The master value in Hegel is freedom, understood as being bei sich selbst in einem anderen, with oneself in another, one's powers fully realized and expressed in one's relations to other people and in how one inhabits a social role under institutions. That's, I think, the ideal. It comes out when Cavell says that he's interested in freedom as having the run of language, as if by a birthright, is the way he puts it. So I think there is, in that sense, a telos. But now, it's a kind of broken telos. There is no stepwise progression to it. There are only partial achievements of it. So the telos is there, but it's a telos towards which we must always, well, there may be some standing constraints. I mean, the rules of morality are something, as it were. But we have to improvise and discover in ourselves always the willingness to repeat our performance of a role with other people as well. So there is a telos, but it's not asymptotic, and it's not stepwise approachable. It is variably approachable, involving improvisation and how one negotiates with others, allowing them their otherness at the same time. That's the way I think of it, at least.
Arata, you're mute. Sorry.
So that's very helpful. So the telos, it seems like it's not, if we don't think of the telos here in terms of a progression, so that's, but in terms of an ideal, right? Not an ideal that we're progressing toward, but an ideal that we are seeking to exemplify, or something like that. If that's the structure of it, and perhaps you're right that that's how we should conceive of Hegelian telos as well. And I think you're right. I mean, there's, there's a passage which I'm sure you know in the Aesthetic Problems of Modern Philosophy, where Cavell brings in Hegel's notion of Aufheben to try to explain Wittgenstein in connection. I mean, it's such a complex paper, but in connection with the impasse between Brooks and Winters, and so surely you're right that he's not like just rejecting Hegelian conception of telos, but it does seem like often in the literature on Hegel, that like teleology is understood as a kind of progression toward an ideal, progression toward absolute knowledge. That phenomenology is all these like transformative steps in a fuller and fuller realization of this. Whereas I guess my sense with Cavell is that it's like the relation to the ideal is understood sort of in terms of exemplarity, making one's life an
That's all
instant.
exactly right. The absolute knowledge part is the part Cavell rejects. Two qualifications only. I mean, there does have to be continuing improvisation and negotiation. I do want to say, as I suggested to you in Addis, that some stable moments are possible. These can last a little bit longer than just the instant. And second, there are forms of practicing that can help. Think of Cavell as a musician practicing scales and harmonic progressions. Those were ways of preparing to be original, as it were. And those preparations are very important. Originality does not spring ex nihilo forth in the absence of these kinds of practice in things like scales and harmonic progressions. So with those two qualifications, I think that's all correct.
I think Rafael was the next in line.
No, actually, my question hinged on Aratus, so I guess Ritter already answered. I was going to say that one proposition that marked the rhythm of Ritter's essay was, we are haunting the world, not living in it properly. So I was going to ask if you could offer us an image of what living in the world properly would look like. But I guess.
Sure, lots of them. First, the happy marriages of pursuits of happiness. Second, Fred Astaire's dancing in, which is the name of the movie, I've now forgotten it, Showboat. And in general, images of people inhabiting their role fully and with what I call cathexis to their role, where they invest themselves in it without a sense of remainder. There are lots of places this can happen in life. It can happen in friendships, sexual relations when they go well, in artistic performance, in doing science. I suppose it can happen when things are going really well in the lab, or when as a mathematician you find an original line of argument that yields a new proof that hadn't been discovered before. It's when you get bound up with, wholeheartedly involved in the course of activity that, that I think selfhood is achieved. It's an exercise of conceptual, judgmental, practical agency, and the more wide it is and the more sustained, the better.
Thank you so much.
And I think art often models this for us for many cases. There are many cases in which not always the characters, it's sometimes the authorial agency behind the work with whom we identify in achieving a kind of fullness of attention to difficult life. So Shakespeare writes about some pretty awful stuff, right? Othello is not a character with which you wish to identify, nor is Macbeth. Or you may identify with certain aspects of them, the glories of their language, for example. But it's Shakespeare's attentiveness to the play between the pursuit of individuality and the circumstances in which it finds itself that I think we maybe really identify with in many of those plays.
Anybody else? Eric said he would like to jump back, but perhaps if somebody else has, somebody who hasn't participated yet has any question. If you don't, just go ahead. I might also have a follow-up later.
I just wanted to introduce potentially into the conversation with Ritter the notion of irony that Jonathan Lear has developed, and that the actualization, or I really appreciate the notion that there is a telos there, but would we say then that what that telos is liable to break down? What it is to be a teacher, or what it is to be a Christian, or the examples that Lear uses. I guess I'm just broadly introducing that question of how close Cavell and Lear are on this notion of freedom within a social institution, but also this always unavoidable possibility, this threat of dissolution.
Yep, no, that's exactly right. And in fact, I end my Kant Benjamin book trying to figure out how to blend, on the one hand, the standing authority of the moral law, Kant's position, with a kind of openness to surprising ecstatic experience, Benjamin's position. I don't think there's any ready way to get some simple conclusion about how to hold on to both of those thoughts. I end the book by weaving together, as it were, Cavell on acknowledgement and Lear on irony. So I think the part I would take is that for Lear, irony is a kind of achievement itself. What one gets in the psychoanalytic process is the ability to hear one's own ambivalences, one's multiple voices that inhabit one. That is, he says, to take an ironic stance towards oneself. And it's a kind of an acknowledgement of constitutive incompleteness. And for Lear, health is being aware of all that. Psychic health is being aware of all that, and not standing on one's commitments and identity in some kind of closed, hard way. That's the mistake that the putative Christians surrounding Kierkegaard make, after all. They think what it is to be a Christian is fixed and settled and non-negotiable, right? So yes, no, I'm quite a fan of Lear on irony, and I think it is, as I've suggested in my writing, closely analogous to Cavell on acknowledgement, right? What I'm calling cadencing here to how to achieve a happy kind of settling despite constitutive incompleteness, as it were. Yep.
I'm glad I'm not nuts. Thank you.
Oh, no, not at all.
perhaps if I can go back to that discussion about music, rhythm, and mimesis, I was thinking that at some point Cavell says, I think it's in the Claim of Reason, but might be somewhere else, that it is a fundamental fact about our biology even, that we can copy the sounds that others make. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to start, speaking and becoming members of a language. And he also says, of course, you all know this, but I just thought it would be a nice connection here. The metaphor he uses for our agreement when we are grown-ups is attunement, and there is this idea of finding some kind of rhythm, shared rhythm. And Richard was also connecting this to the marriages in the remarriage comedies. And I think it's important, going back to my first point about the achievement being always temporary. Of course, I agree. The case of the marriages in those comedies are examples of finding that rhythm, but we also are supposed to remember that those movies do not end with "and they would be happy ever after" as the classical comedy. So there is always this risk. I think there is no such thing as finding the perfect rhythm forever, even in a marriage. So supposedly there will be new challenges, and I think that would make for a better marriage. It's always a kind of remarriage, I suppose. This is going beyond anything that I just thinking aloud here, but perhaps that connection between rhythm, music, attunement, and this constant task of finding some kind of stability, it's a connection that is useful here. And Andreas said something about jazz music, and perhaps jazz is a good image for us to think about these topics too. So that's just a comment that I couldn't keep thinking about those images.
Well, just two short remarks on that. The movies typically end, particularly The Lady Eve and It Happened One Night, with a shot, and The Philadelphia Story in a way, with a shot from outside the marriage. And It Happened One Night, it's memorably from the perspective of the older couple who are running the motel, and they're from outside. They see the lights go out, and we with them hear the trumpet sounding, announcing the fall of the walls of Jericho. I think the suggestion there is that we approve what we take them to have accomplished and wish for it for ourselves. It's a measure of a democratic society, of the worth of society, whether it makes this kind of achievement possible for many or all of its members. But we, like the older couple, are not inside it, right? So there's an interesting way in which we all resonate to the achievement and wish for it for ourselves, even if we don't immediately share in it. The happiness comes pairwise in that book. The second thought is, yes, there's some willingness for repetition that must be embraced or attained somehow. These are, after all, comedies of remarriage, several of them occurring in the face of actual divorce, or at least under the threat of dissolution. I want to resist, though, the idea that it's always something that feels like work in the sense of something imposed. I do think, and this may be just autobiographical, having had the luck of, so far as I can tell, an enormously happy marriage, there's some sense of confidence in one's ability to know how to improvise when you need to, I think, that I would want to point to. It's not all in crisis moment to moment, or it needn't be, I think. So those are two short remarks.
Oh, yeah, of course, I agree with that. We have a question in the chat. Perhaps we could go to that one. It's in two parts from Rafael.
Mm-hmm.
Is that adequate to say that the achievement of selfhood is related to aesthetic claims, in a sense, as you said, when it is proper to claim how beautiful is a happy marriage, and so on, a happy marriage, perhaps?
Was there more to that, or is there more I'm not seeing yet?
No, I think it's the same, isn't it? Let me see.
So the answer is yes. I have a pretty wide scope sense of the aesthetic without wanting to go to the recent literature on the aesthetics of daily life exactly. I do think that the kind of cathexis to a role, the achievement of freedom in occupying a role that may happen in a marriage, has an extremely important affective dimension to it. Things over time hang together and make sense in something like the way in which the different elements of a work of art hang together and make sense. So it's at least an analog or metaphor, maybe the very same thing. I have to think a bit more about that. Why laughing at each other's jokes is very important in the comedies of remarriage, among other things. Yeah. They're achieving felt enjoyment of each other in their responsiveness to each other.
Well, if nobody else would like to add something now, I would just have a quick question, but before that I would mention that it is kind of funny that you put on screen the same passage of aesthetic problems of modern philosophy that haunted me in my 20s undergraduate, so that was interesting. But moving on, my question would be that it seems to me that part of the achievement or the achieving of selfhood, especially in relations that we have with each other, marriage, friendship, and also in relations we have with our daily lives, be it our manual works, cooking, washing the dishes, and so on and so forth. They, how can I say this? It seems to me that part of achieving selfhood in these activities and in these relations revolves around we coming to realize that there will be crisis in a way. It feels like in pursuit of happiness, part of the happy ending that is open for more crisis in the future is not forever happily ever after. It is the realization that crisis will come, that there are always risks, there are always dangers of connecting with other people. I don't know if you would agree or comment on that.
No, I think so. I mean, the point of the comedies of remarriage, though, is that the most dramatic possible risk, dissolution of the marriage, has been faced and overcome. And I do think in the approval from outside shots, especially at the endings, the suggestion is we have some confidence in their ability to manage their futures, having overcome the crisis that they've overcome. Of course, it's not certain in the way that the proof of a theorem in mathematics may be certain. It's a matter of their having developed with each other practical skills we can trust. They will need to exercise those skills. That's certainly true. And it's always true that life can change enough that the exercise of those skills in a way that each finds mutually satisfying can be defeated. That can happen. There are unhappy marriages too, after all. But I think the movies are giving us a model of the achievement of this kind of practical skill of reciprocity and interaction and mutual enjoyment that we're supposed to trust and value.
Thanks.
We still have some time if anybody else would like to intervene. Arata, please.
So this is an extremely broad question, but I think it is sort of, I think it was implicit in your talk. This is just about like how you perceive the connection between, so to speak, what Wittgenstein and Tatasov calls the problems of life. I mean, the problems of life and the problems of philosophy. And I think, you were suggesting that for Cavell, these are like really inseparable from one another. that achievement of self. It's not just the philosophy needs to correctly represent or articulate, the problems of selfhood and its achievement, but that there's a more intimate connection between philosophy and the problems of life, so to speak. That at some level they're one and the same. That I think you mentioned Cavell's involvement with psychoanalysis and I think many people have sort of commented on or attested to, like the in a way sort of the inseparability of philosophy, the indistinguishability in a sense of philosophy and life for Cavell, that comes out in that might be disclosed in, like, one's dealings with him, if you had dealings with them. So anyway, this is just sort of an open and very large question, but like just an open invitation to remark on, like, how the connection between life and philosophy for Cavell. I might. You think that I think you were suggesting that they're really they're really inseparable.
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. I think of philosophy, or at any rate, the kind of philosophy I care about, as beginning, as Cavell says, in disappointment, frustration, and perplexity. And what it aims at is getting a clearer view of things and a clearer view of our own commitments, clearer and more satisfying view of our own commitments in relations to things. A model for this is in that crucial essay, Aesthetic Problems, where the fundamental analogy is between the claims of the ordinary language philosopher, the claims of the art critic, and the claims of the work of the modernist artist. In each case, those claims are entered in the hope of agreement, not in the thought that agreement can be nailed down or guaranteed by method. What the critic does, the clearest case, is call your attention to details in the hope that you will get it, and then come to shared responsiveness, shared enjoyment, through having somehow just had the significance of the details click for you. The best piece, really parallel to Cavell's, I know, on this, is Arnold Eisenberg's famous essay, Critical Communication. The argument of the critic is not a deductive one, it's an elucidatory or perceptual one. We are invited to pay attention to certain details and see how they hang together in the hope of, right? Eisenberg writes that when the critic has done his work, communion may or may not follow, right? If we're lucky, sometimes it does. What we need is this kind of heightened receptivity towards and responsiveness to life itself. That's what I think philosophy is all about. It's why I think philosophy is one of the core humanities, and interestingly affiliated with the other humanities subjects, and not in the end properly modeled on science. Logic is a piece of philosophy. I wouldn't throw logic out of the set of requirements, for example, but it's not the royal road to truth in philosophy. Getting a vocabulary, an angle of vision on things, as Wittgenstein once put it, that's the thing that really matters.
Although we still have some minutes. Oh, Arata was going to say something. You're mute now. We can't hear you.
Nice. Oh, did I? Oh, okay, yeah.
Were you going to say something? We couldn't hear you.
Because you were no, I said no. Thank you for that. That's yeah. I mean, I completely agree, particularly in the context of Cavell. And I think you're right. The Aesthetic Problems paper. I mean, I keep going back to that paper myself. It's it seems to contain in sort of kernel form and not just in kernel form, I guess, a lot that Cavell develops later on.
Well, here's an interesting and frightening thought. For some 20 years, I have been teaching that paper to my introductory philosophy students as a model of what philosophy can and should be. And some of them really get it. And alas, when they really get it, they find that they can't talk to the other members of my philosophy department who do not have any kind of grip on this at all, who think of themselves as theorists. It's a maddening, frustrating thing. So there's a real worry. It seems to them that Cavell is just, one of my colleagues once accused me, as colleagues will, of, how did he put it? Turning philosophy or deflating philosophy into bad literature, right? No arguments anymore. There's a way in which that's right? I just want the philosophical literature to be as good as, and some of it is as good as, the real literature. Right? I think the suppression of philosophy as one of the core humanities subjects, this is something we owe to the rise of analytic philosophy, especially the influences of Russell and Carnap, I think. So I really worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, when people, like colleagues and other philosophers, stress importance of argument, which of course, I know you would never, say that the argument should be taken out of philosophy. No one would say, nobody, no real philosopher would say, argument should be taken out of philosophy. But so much of the action seems like it's happening, so to speak, maybe in the argument, but in that's not just simply expressed in the articulation of the propositions in the argument, but what, so to speak, lies behind, those propositions in the transition between, the logical transition between them, and it seems like that's just simply true of all great philosophy.
That's basically what I tried to show 40 years ago in my PhD dissertation, in which I claimed that Descartes, Frege, and Davidson had no compelling sound demonstrative arguments for their views, but used the machinery of argument to deploy a new set of metaphors that gave us a new angle of vision on things. So they really matter. They just don't matter in the way people think they matter. And then I argue that Wittgenstein saw this fact explicitly about philosophy itself, and that roughly explains the form of the investigations. That's a lot, but I've been thinking about that topic for, a long time.
Yeah, well, and I just, to it seems like the writing on skepticism, to me, the best writing on skepticism is one that, tries to find the action happening, so to speak, underneath the argument. And so people who say, well, I don't see the argument for that. I don't see any reason to hold out. You haven't given me an argument. Well, in a sense, that could be, a genuine complaint and a reasonable complaint. But no philosophical position, it seems to me, has really been bolstered simply by an argument, and so its argument is sort of an articulation and logical form of, what Cavell, calls a plight of mind, and that is, yeah, I mean, there's just this sort of false dichotomy between, well, okay, put it in argumentative form versus, oh, well, if you can't do that, then it's just bad literature, and I think it does seem like it's something that people, I feel like I'm struggling with that, just in the profession all the time.
Agree completely, and I worry not only about the profession, but in the technocratic culture in which the profession now exists, to which much of its shape seems to be owed, right? Yeah, no, this is a real worry.
The discussion is super fascinating, and I think we are all worried about those topics, but we are now running out of time. So, but I think Eric you were starting to say something with you. You started and then stopped. So, if you want to.
Well, I just wonder. This is another big question, but thinking specifically about Cavell in this region, on the one hand, there's clearly what this wonderful discussion was just talking about, the intimate relations between philosophy as responsiveness to felt problems of human existence or something like that. But on the other hand, there's this real dedication to inheritance in the history of philosophy. So, is there a tension there? There's not a tension there. So how do we understand that not
major texts have that kind of responsiveness, I think. Sometimes in the form of argument or disguised under the argument, but they have that kind of responsiveness to felt problems in life. I think that's true of Descartes, of Aristotle, of Augustine, of Locke, of every major philosopher you can think of. Right? What they're doing is motivated by real perplexities about life.
Thank you. Yeah, so much to think about.
If I could just say that when Gordon Baker came to Brazil, he gave a speech called "A Vision of Philosophy," and his claim was that philosophy starts when the other voices some sort of dissatisfaction about some reason of the experience of meaning, and then the ball starts rolling. I thought that was interesting. He thought that was perhaps his way of glossing his disagreement with Peter Hacker. No.
Was that when Cavell was here in Brazil?
I don't know. I wasn't in Brazil. I read about that.
I wasn't in that occasion, but I heard people told me that there was an event that Cavell was invited to, and Baker was too. And I think it was the first time that Baker met Cavell in person. It was in Brazil, in Rio, in 2000 or something like that. But that's just a curiosity.
Not sure. That was in São Paulo, the Gordon Baker.
Okay, so
speech.
Well, friends, we really have to stop because we have another conference, hopefully in 30 minutes, less than that. But I would like to thank everybody, especially Richard and Eric, for the great discussion that we had, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks. It was amazing, guys.
Thanks.